There was a time when Chicago wore a different face. A time when the city's heartbeat moved to a slower, steadier rhythm, and the streets themselves seemed to hold stories in every brick and cobblestone. If you were there, if you walked those sidewalks in the 1950s, breathing in the coal-tinged air mixed with the aroma of fresh bread from corner bakeries, then you know what I'm talking about. You remember. And if you're watching this today, wherever you are in this world, I want you to close your eyes for a moment and travel back with me to a Chicago that exists now only in fading photographs and in the chambers of our hearts. Because what we're about to remember together is something precious, something that slipped through our fingers while we weren't looking. This is about more than just a city or a decade. It's about a way of life that shaped who we became. Before we dive deep into those memories, I need something from you. Yes, you, the person watching this right now. We're building something special here on this channel. A community of people who understand that looking back isn't about living in the past, it's about honoring where we came from. So here's what I'm asking. Let's make this video reach 100 comments. That's our goal together. 100 voices sharing their memories, their thoughts, their own pieces of this puzzle we're assembling. And please, watch this all the way to the end. Not just because it helps us bring you more stories like this one, though it absolutely does, but because the ending holds something important, a reflection that might just change how you see your own journey. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, because when you do, the universe notices. You'll be notified first, you'll be remembered first by the platform, and you won't miss a single story we share. The algorithm rewards those who stay, who engage, who become part of the conversation. And here's the thing. We need to hit this goal to keep bringing you more inspiring stories like this one. Your comment, even if it's just a few words about what this video made you feel, it matters. It tells me you were here. It tells me this connected with something inside you. So stick with me until the very end and then leave a motivational comment, something from your heart. Those who watch all the way through are remembered faster by the platform. They're the ones who get priority. So stay with me, will you? Now let me take you back. Back to the Chicago of the 1950s, when the city was a symphony of sounds that you could never quite forget once you'd heard them. The elevated trains, the L as everyone called it, rattling overhead on tracks that seemed to frame the sky itself, creating a ceiling of steel and movement above the streets. The screech of metal on metal as those trains rounded curves wasn't noise back then. It was the sound of life happening, of people going places, of a city that never stopped, but somehow never felt rushed either. Picture State Street on a Saturday morning in 1953. The department stores stood like palaces along that grand boulevard, their windows dressed with a care and artistry that seems almost quaint now. Marshall Field's, Carson Perry Scott, these weren't just stores, they were institutions, monuments to commerce and community. Women wore hats and gloves to go shopping downtown. Not because they had to, but because that's what you did. There was a dignity in the ritual, a respect for the occasion of simply going to town. Men wore fedoras tipped just so, and their shoes were polished to a shine that caught the morning light. Children held their parents' hands tightly, eyes wide at the grandeur of it all. At the doormen in brass-buttoned uniforms who would tip their caps and hold doors open with practiced grace. The smell of those stores, do you remember? That particular combination of perfume from the cosmetics counters, the leather from the shoe department, the crisp newness of fabric in the clothing sections, all mingling together into something that spelled sophistication and possibility. The elevators were operated by attendants who called out each floor with practiced cadence. Second floor, ladies' wear, notions and accessories. Their white gloves moved smoothly across the brass controls, and you felt safe in those little ascending rooms, certain that someone was looking after things, that order prevailed. But Chicago in the 1950s wasn't just downtown grandeur. It was neighborhoods, dozens of them, each with its own character, its own heartbeat. Walk through Bridgeport and you'd hear Polish being spoken on every corner. Smell kielbasa cooking, see men in undershirts sitting on stoops in the summer heat, playing cards and arguing good-naturedly about the White Sox. South Side, North Side, West Side, these weren't just directions, they were identities. You didn't just live in Chicago, you lived in your neighborhood. And that neighborhood defined you in ways that people today might struggle to understand. The taverns, my God, the taverns. Every other block seemed to have one. These dark, cool refuges with names like the Shamrock, the Blue Note, Mike's Place. Not bars, mind you. Taverns. There's a difference. A tavern was where the working man went after his shift at the stockyards or the steel mill, where he'd have a beer and a shot, talk about the Cubs' chances, complain about the foreman, laugh with guys he'd known since grade school. The bartender knew everyone's name, knew what they drank, knew when to listen and when to change the subject. These places were social clubs, confessionals, living rooms for men whose actual living rooms were crowded with kids and responsibilities. The sawdust on the floor, the mirror behind the bar advertising Old Style or Schlitz, the free lunch laid out on the bar, hard-boiled eggs and pickles, and sometimes, if you were lucky, a bit of corned beef. These details painted a picture of community, of belonging. The stockyards. We need to talk about the Union stockyards because you couldn't talk about 1950 Chicago without them. They called Chicago hog butcher for the world, and that wasn't poetry. That was literal truth. The yards covered square miles, a city within the city, where hundreds of thousands of animals arrived by rail and left as packaged meat. The smell, especially on hot summer days when the wind blew from the south and west, it was overwhelming, unforgettable. The smell of blood and animal and industry and money. It sounds terrible when I describe it now, but if you grew up there, if your father worked there and his father before him, that smell meant jobs, meant wages, meant food on your table. Men went to work before dawn and came home after dark, covered in blood and exhausted, but they had work. Steady work. You knew where you stood. The neighborhoods near the yards were working class in every sense. Wooden frame houses packed tight together, sometimes 3 families in a building meant for one. Clotheslines stretched across backyards like bunting, with sheets and shirts and diapers flapping in the breeze. Kids played stickball in the streets, and when a car came, which wasn't often because not everyone had one yet, they'd scatter to the curbs and then drift back once it passed. Summer nights, you'd see families sitting on their porches, trying to catch any breath of cool air. The fathers in their undershirts with a beer, the mothers shelling peas or snapping beans, the kids running around with fireflies in jars, trying to hold on to the magic of evening. Television was still relatively new in the early 50s. Not every family had one, and those who did often had neighbors over to watch. I love Lucy on Monday nights, The Honeymooners, your show of shows with Sid Caesar. The TV set was a piece of furniture, substantial and important, often with a doily on top and the good lamp beside it. Families gathered around it like previous generations had gathered around the radio, but with the added magic of pictures, of seeing these people in your living room, sharing their lives with yours. When the national anthem played at the end of the broadcast day and the test pattern came on, that was it. The evening was over. Time for bed. But before television took over, radio was still king. WGN, WBBM, these call letters meant something. You had your programs you never missed. The Green Hornet, The Shadow, Fibber McGee, and Molly. The voices came out of that wooden box and created entire worlds in your imagination. Some say that was better, that having to picture it yourself made it more real somehow, more personal. The whole family would sit there in the living room, lights low, listening. each person seeing something slightly different in their mind's eye, but all together in the experience. The diners and lunch counters of 1950s Chicago were democratic institutions. The guy in the suit sat next to the guy in the work clothes, both of them hunched over the counter, maybe reading the Tribune or the Sun-Times while they ate. The waitresses, and there were always waitresses back then, never servers, knew how to handle any situation. They called everyone hun and moved with an efficiency that came from doing the same dance 1,000 times. They'd slap down your plate of eggs and hash browns, refill your coffee without asking, and somehow keep track of 6 different orders in their heads. The coffee was strong enough to wake the dead, served in heavy ceramic mugs that could survive being dropped, and probably had been more than once. Pie was a given. Apple, cherry, lemon meringue, displayed in a rotating case near the register. And it was real pie, made that morning, with crusts that crumbled just right and filling that didn't taste like it came from a can. The milkman still delivered in the 1950s. Did you have one? The bottles left on your porch in the early morning, the cream rising to the top, that little cardboard cap you'd poke through. There was the Iceman, too, in the early part of the decade before everyone had electric refrigerators. He'd carry a massive block of ice with tongs over his shoulder, chips flying off as he walked, and kids would follow him, begging for those chips on hot days. The knife sharpener came around with his cart and his grinding wheel. The vegetable man with his truck. These were the rhythms of daily life, the comings and goings that marked time. Churches were full on Sundays. You didn't even question it. Catholic, Protestant, Jewish synagogues on Saturday, it didn't matter. You went. That was just what people did. The churches were architectural marvels, many of them, built by immigrant communities who'd pooled their resources to create something beautiful, something worthy. St. Stanislaus Kostka, Holy Name Cathedral. St. Michael's in Old Town with its bells that could be heard for blocks. Inside, the light came through stained glass and jewel tones, and even if you didn't consider yourself particularly religious, there was something about the solemnity, the ritual, the sense of being part of something larger than yourself. After church, families would gather for Sunday dinner, the one meal of the week where everyone was expected to be present. Pot roast, chicken, ham, mashed potatoes, vegetables that had been cooked until they were soft. The good dishes came out, the ones that were wedding presents or had been passed down. Conversation flowed around that table, solving the world's problems, sharing news and gossip, arguing about politics or sports, the fundamental work of being a family. Schools were different then too. Strict, orderly, with clear expectations and consequences. Teachers were respected authorities, and if you got in trouble at school, you got in trouble again at home. No one questioned the teacher. The classroom had the alphabet running along the wall above the blackboard, big cursive letters that you'd practice copying into your composition book. Dick and Jane readers taught you to read. See Spot Run. Run, Spot, run. We laugh about it now, but those simple words opened doors. Arithmetic was done with pencil and paper, showing your work, no calculators because they didn't exist yet. You memorized your times tables and the state capitals and the Gettysburg Address. Friday afternoons meant spelling bees or mental arithmetic challenges. Recess was sacred, a chance to burn off energy in the schoolyard, playing dodgeball or tetherball or just running in great anarchic packs until the bell rang. The movie theaters, the palaces of escape and wonder. The Chicago Theater on State Street, with its vertical sign reaching toward the sky, its marquee promising adventure and romance and laughter. Inside, these theaters were ornate beyond belief. Chandeliers, velvet curtains, gilt decorations, soaring ceilings that made you feel like you'd stepped into another world. And you had For the price of admission, less than $1, you got a newsreel, a cartoon, maybe a cereal, and then the feature film. You settled into those plush seats and the lights dimmed and the curtain rose. And for 2 hours you were somewhere else entirely. Jimmy Stewart, Marlon Brando, Grace Kelly, Marilyn Monroe, these weren't just actors. They were icons, gods and goddesses of a modern mythology. Going to the movies was an event. You dressed up, you behaved. The usher with his flashlight made sure of that. Summer in Chicago in the 50s meant the lakefront. Lake Michigan, that vast inland sea, provided relief from the heat and humidity. Families would pack sandwiches and lemonade and take the bus to the beach. North Avenue Beach, Oak Street Beach, Rainbow Beach on the south side. Kids would play in the water under the watchful eyes of mothers who never quite relaxed, always counting heads, making sure everyone was accounted for. Fathers would try to nap on blankets, newspapers spread over their faces. Transistor radios played, someone always had one, and you'd hear the Cubs game or music, doo-wop and early rock and roll starting to change everything. At night, you might go to Riverview, the amusement park on the north side, the roller coasters, the Ferris wheel, the Midway with its games of chance and skill. The screams and laughter, the smell of popcorn and cotton candy, the lights reflecting off the Chicago River. Riverview is gone now, torn down in the 60s, but for those who experienced it, the memory remains vivid, a kingdom of joy that existed for one brief season of history. Winter was something else entirely. Chicago winters have always been brutal, but in the 50s, before we had the technology to fight back quite so effectively, winter meant something different. Snow piled high, and kids built forts and had snowball fights that ranged across entire blocks. You'd come in frozen, your fingers and toes numb, and your mother would make you hot chocolate. Real chocolate melted into milk and heated on the stove, not from a packet. She'd hang your wet clothes on the radiator to dry, and that wet wool smell would fill the kitchen. The radiators clanked and hissed, providing a soundtrack to the winter months. At night, frost patterns formed on the inside of windows, delicate ferns of ice that you could scrape away with a fingernail. The furnace in the basement roared and groaned, doing its best to keep the cold at bay. The cars of the 1950s were works of art, chrome and steel sculptures that announced their presence. Chevrolet Bel Airs, Ford Fairlanes, Cadillac Eldorados with tail fins that could take your eye out if you weren't careful. These cars were status symbols, but they were also just transportation, tools for getting around. Not everyone had one. Plenty of families managed with public transportation, the buses and the L trains and the streetcars that still ran in the early 50s. But if you did have a car, you took care of it. You washed it every weekend, waxed it until it gleamed. The interior smelled like vinyl and gasoline and possibility. No seat belts, no air conditioning, just windows you rolled down by hand and the wind in your face as you drove. Music was changing in the 1950s, and Chicago was part of that revolution. The blues had been born in the Mississippi Delta, but it grew up in Chicago. Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, Willie Dixon, these men brought the Delta blues north and electrified it, plugged it in, and turned it up. The clubs on the south and west sides were where it happened, small, smoky places where the music was raw and real and powerful. White kids started hearing this music, started being drawn to it despite their parents' objections. Chuck Berry, a kid from St. Louis who recorded in Chicago, took that blues foundation and created something new, something that spoke to teenagers in a way nothing had before. Rock and roll was being born, and Chicago was one of its birthplaces. The diners weren't just places to eat, they were social centers, especially for teenagers. After the movie or the sock hop at the gym, you'd go to the diner. Sit in the booth with your friends, order French fries and a Coke, and talk for hours. The jukebox was always playing. A nickel for one song, 5 songs for a quarter. You'd punch in the numbers and letters, and the mechanism inside would whir and clunk, and the record would drop, and the song would start. Everyone knew the popular songs, could sing along, though the owner would shush you if you got too loud. These were the moments of connection, of belonging, of feeling like you were part of something. First crushes happened in those booths. First heartbreaks. Friendships that would last a lifetime were forged over baskets of onion rings and cherry phosphates. The working world was more secure then, or at least it felt that way. If you got a job at a factory or with the city or the railroad, you expected to stay there. Maybe for your whole career. Companies had pensions. Your job was your identity. When men met, one of the first questions was, "What do you do?" And the answer meant something. The unions were strong, a real force, and they'd fought for the 8-hour day, for weekends, for safety regulations, for a wage that could support a family. There was pride in work, even hard work, maybe especially hard work. You clocked in, you did your job, you clocked out. You earned your pay. The corner grocery store wasn't a corporation. It was owned by the Kowalskis or the Murphys or the Cohens. They knew you by name, knew your family. You could run a tab if times were tight, pay at the end of the week when you got paid. The produce might not have been as perfect as what we expect now, might have had a bruise or a blemish, but it was real food, grown in soil, not engineered in a lab. The butcher would cut your meat to order, wrap it in white paper, tie it with string. Penny candy sat in jars on the counter, and kids would spend long minutes deciding how to allocate their precious cents. Licorice whips, jawbreakers, Mary Janes, wax bottles with colored sugar water inside. The decision seemed momentous. Saturday mornings were for chores, the whole family pitching in. Lawns to be mowed, hedges to be trimmed, the sidewalk to be swept. The house to be cleaned from top to bottom, floors to be mopped, windows to be washed, laundry to be done. The washing machine was a luxury, and if you had one, you counted yourself lucky. Otherwise, it was the laundromat hauling bags of clothes, sitting on hard plastic chairs while the machines ran through their cycles, reading a magazine or watching the clothes tumble through the round windows. Dryers were even less common. Clotheslines were the default, and there was a satisfaction in hanging those clean clothes, in the snap of sheets in the wind, in bringing them in hours later, smelling of sunshine and fresh air. Evenings in the neighborhood meant sitting outside, on porches, on stoops, in folding chairs on the sidewalk. People talked to each other, called greetings across the street, kept an eye on all the kids, not just their own. If you did something wrong, Mrs. O'Brien down the block would correct you, and you'd better listen because she'd tell your mother. This wasn't considered intrusive or overstepping. This was community. This was looking out for each other. This was the web of relationships that made life manageable, that meant you weren't alone. The Sears catalog was a source of endless fascination, especially for kids. That thick book arrived in the mail, and you could spend hours flipping through it, dreaming about the toys or the clothes or the tools. At Christmas time, you'd circle the things you wanted, knowing full well you'd only get 1 or 2 if you were lucky. The anticipation was part of the gift. The wishing and hoping and imagining. Halloween meant homemade costumes, not store-bought. Your mother would create something from old clothes and cardboard and imagination. You'd go trick-or-treating in your neighborhood, only your neighborhood, and you knew every house you visited. People gave homemade popcorn balls, apples, sometimes cookies they'd baked. Nobody worried about tampering because everyone knew everyone. The jack-o'-lanterns were carved from real pumpkins. The inside scooped out into bowls to be baked into pies later. A candle burning inside, the flickering light making the carved face come alive. Christmas brought decorations that would probably be considered fire hazards now. Real candles on the tree if you were old-fashioned, or those big bulbs that got hot enough to burn you if you touched them. Tinsel applied strand by strand, carefully, and saved from year to year. The tree stayed up through New Year's, sometimes beyond. Gifts were modest by today's standards. A doll, a toy truck, a new pair of gloves. But they were treasured. Christmas morning meant waking early, shivering because the heat had been turned down overnight, racing to see what Santa had brought, the stockings bulging with an orange in the toe, nuts, candy canes. The smell of pine and cinnamon, of turkey roasting, of potential and grace. The phone on the wall with its rotary dial. You had one phone, probably in the kitchen or the hallway, and everyone in the family shared it. If you were lucky, you had your own line. If not, you had a party line shared with one or more other families, and you had to wait your turn. And everyone could listen in if they wanted to, though that was considered rude. Long-distance calls were expensive, something you saved for special occasions. When the phone rang, everyone stopped what they were doing. It could be important. It could be news. You answered formally, stating your name or just hello, and you didn't know who was on the other end until they spoke. No caller ID, no way to screen, just the mystery and obligation of the ringing phone. Letters were still how people communicated across distances. Real letters, written by hand on stationery, folded into envelopes, stamped, and mailed. You'd wait days or weeks for a reply. The mailman was an important figure, bringing news from distant relatives, bills, magazines, the occasional package. Getting mail was exciting, tangible proof that someone out there was thinking of you. You'd recognize the handwriting on the envelope before you even opened it. Letters were kept, tied with ribbon, stored in boxes, rediscovered years later, portals to the past. The pace of life was slower, but that didn't mean it was easier. People worked hard, long hours. Money was tight for most families. There were worries, always worries. The rent, the mortgage, the doctor bills, the cost of shoes for growing kids. But there was also a sense that you were all in it together, that your neighbors understood because they were going through the same things. There was less isolation, less anonymity. For better or worse, you were known. You were part of the fabric of your neighborhood, your church, your community. Looking back now from the distance of 7 decades, it's tempting to romanticize the 1950s, to see them through a soft focus lens that blurs the hard edges. And yes, there were hard edges. Racism was codified in law and custom. Women's opportunities were limited. Conformity was prized, and those who didn't fit the mold suffered. The decade had its shadows, and we shouldn't forget them. But there were also things we lost as we moved forward, things we didn't realize were valuable until they were gone. The sense of community. The slower pace that allowed for conversation, for front porch sitting, for knowing your neighbors. The stability, even if it was sometimes stifling. The shared culture, the common touchstones that meant you could strike up a conversation with a stranger because you'd both seen the same TV show or heard the same song or remembered the same headline. Chicago in the 1950s was a city of neighborhoods, a city of work, a city reaching toward the future while still rooted in traditions brought from the old country. It was a city of extremes, blazing summers and brutal winters, soaring skyscrapers and ramshackle houses, immense wealth and grinding poverty. It was a city of sounds. The elevated trains, the factory whistles, the church bells, the vendors calling out their wares, the children playing in the streets. It was a city of smells, stockyards and bakeries, lake water and coal smoke, perfume from the department stores and sweat from the taverns. It was a city that was alive in a way that seems almost impossible now when so much of life is mediated through screens, when community is virtual and neighborhoods are just places you sleep. The men and women who lived through those years, who walked those streets, who worked those jobs, who raised their families in those bungalows and apartments. They shaped the world we live in now. They fought in wars, built infrastructure, created art, raised children who would go on to change everything. They lived through tremendous transformation, from the Depression to the war to the post-war boom, and they adapted, survived, thrived as best they could. Their stories matter. Their memories matter. The world they knew, that Chicago of the 1950s, it's gone now, swept away by time and progress and the relentless forward march of history. The stockyards are gone, replaced by industrial parks and vacant lots. Riverview is gone, its laughter silenced. Many of the grand movie palaces are gone, torn down or converted to other uses. The neighborhood taverns have closed, the corner groceries replaced by chain stores. The faces have changed. The languages on the streets have changed. The city has moved on, as cities do, as they must. But for those who remember, for those who were there, those streets still exist. They exist in memory, vivid and real, more real sometimes than the present. The sound of the L train, the smell of fresh bread, the feeling of your father's hand holding yours as you cross State Street, the taste of that pie from the diner, the voice of the radio announcer, the scratch of the needle on the record, the warmth of the radiator on a cold night. These things are still there, inside you, part of who you are, part of what made you. And maybe that's what nostalgia really is. Not a desire to go back, we can't go back, but a recognition of the journey, an honoring of where we've been, an acknowledgement that we carry those places and times and people with us always. They shaped us, they made us. And remembering them, talking about them, sharing those memories, that's how we keep them alive. That's how we say thank you. That's how we testify that we were there, that it happened, that it mattered. The Chicago of the 1950s was a time America will never see again because time only moves in one direction. But it was real. It existed. And if you were there, if you remember, then it still exists in you. And that's something precious. That's something worth holding on to. That's something worth sharing with those who come after, so they can understand, so they can know, so they can appreciate the road that brought them here. Every generation thinks their time was special, and maybe they're all right. Maybe every time is special to those who lived it. But there was something about those post-war years, about that particular moment in Chicago's long history, that deserves to be remembered, deserves to be honored, deserves to be told and retold until the last person who was there has spoken their piece. Perhaps we didn't know it then, couldn't have known it, but we were living through something that wouldn't last. We thought those neighborhoods would always be there, that those institutions would endure, that the world we knew would still be recognizable to our grandchildren. But change came faster than anyone expected. The city transformed. America transformed. And now, looking back across the decades, we can see how unique that moment was, how unrepeatable. The streets of Chicago in the 1950s were paved with the dreams and sweat and struggles of millions of people just trying to live their lives with dignity and purpose. They succeeded more than they probably realized. They created something that lasted long enough for us to remember, to talk about, to hold up as an example of what was and what might have been. And maybe, in the remembering, we find something we need for today. Maybe in those old stories we find wisdom or comfort, or simply the reassurance that people have always faced uncertainty and change, and they've always found ways to keep going, to hold on to what matters, to build something worth remembering. So here we are, all these years later, still thinking about those streets, those sounds, those days that seemed like they'd never end but ended all the same. Chicago in the 1950s, a time America will never see again. But a time we'll never forget, not while memory endures, not while there's someone left to say, I was there, I remember. This is how it was, and it was something. It really was something. And if you want, tell me from which corner of the world you are watching this video. Your comment matters, and I want to read it and respond to you. For more exciting stories like this, click on the video that appears on your screen right now.